Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really complex and often sensitive deep dive. We're looking at material concerning the marital life of the Prophet Muhammad. And this topic, as you probably know, is a major focal point for critics. They raise some very detailed questions about his polygamy, his marriage to Zainab bint Jahsh, and his relations with concubines.
That's right. And we've gathered sources that tackle these critiques head-on, giving us detailed responses from two major traditions within Islamic scholarship.
Okay, so who are we talking about?
Well, first you have the classical scholars. Their arguments are grounded firmly in the 7th century historical context, the Quran and the Hadith, the traditional foundation.
And the second group?
Then you have the modern scholars. They are trying to integrate contemporary ethics, human rights concerns, and what they see as the overall trajectory of Islamic reform.
Okay, let's be really clear here. Our mission is absolutely not to adjudicate any of this. It's to impartially present the arguments so you can understand the nuances behind these two frameworks.
Exactly. The central tension we're exploring is this. Was the Prophet a universal moral exemplar whose every single action is meant to be replicated?
Or were certain actions legislative, mission-specific, and, tied to the norms of his time? That's the core question here.
It is. And what's fascinating is that both groups agree this isn't simple. It demands a real theological and legal synthesis to connect the history to timeless moral principles.
So let's start with the most immediate legal question, the one that critics frame as, a blatant double standard. Why was the Prophet permitted to have, 11 or 13 wives, when the Quran explicitly limits other Muslim men to a maximum of 4?
It's the first question everyone asks.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, as the sources point out, that limit of 4 was itself seen as a huge restriction.
A restriction on what was there before.
Exactly. On the prior practice of, unlimited polygyny in pre-Islamic Arabia. So the argument is that Islam was regulating the practice, not inventing it.
Okay, but what about his specific exemption? How do the scholars explain that?
Both schools cite a divine allowance, but they frame its purpose a little differently.
Let's start with the classical defense. What's the fundamental legal justification for them?
For them, it's rooted in law and necessity. They cite Quran 33.50, arguing the Prophet had a specific legal status. It's called Kushushiyat ala-Nabi.
That's a mouthful. What does that special legal status actually mean in practice? Is it just a convenient exception?
No, it means his marriages were seen as public, almost. Legislative acts, not purely private, personal choices.
So because he was the lawgiver, his actions had to be public and instructional.
Precisamente. They set precedents for the whole community, the Ummah. He actually had some restrictions others didn't have, but he was also given permissions others didn't get. It was part of the job, so to speak.
That makes sense in a context where leaders dictated law through personal example, but what about the wives themselves?
That's a huge part of the classical defense. The Quran forbade his widows, the mothers of the believers, from ever remarrying. So they argue it would have been incredibly unjust to just divorce them to meet a new limit of 4. The exemption actually protected their status and their livelihood.
I see. So the exemption was tied up in public duty and a kind of social justice for those specific women. Now, how does the modern defense shift that frame?
The modern approach focuses more on the functional context. They argue the exemption was primarily functional, not for personal indulgence.
And they point to his age, right?
Yes, most of these later marriages were contracted after he was 50, well past the typical age for seeking that kind of companionship.
So what were the functions then?
2 main goals. First, strengthening tribal alliances. Marriage was the #1 political tool in 7th century Arabia to bring warring tribes together.
A diplomatic tool.
The primary one. And second, and this is often overlooked, these marriages were a form of social welfare. Many of his later wives were vulnerable widows or divorcees, women who needed protection.
I see. So the modern argument is that the moral example is in his justice and kindness in doing these duties, not in copying the specific number of wives he had.
That's it, exactly. And both schools, interestingly, bring up a comparative defense.
Comparing him to other prophets in the Abrahamic faiths?
Yes. They note that many major figures, Abraham, David, Solomon, also practiced polygamy. Their point is that strict monogamy wasn't some universal standard for prophets.
And they also argue that Jesus's unmarried status isn't a binding model for everyone either.
Right. It helps put the practice in a much broader religious historical context.
Okay, that provides context, but even so, the principle of fairness. That must have been incredibly challenging. How did he manage equality with so many wives?
This is something Islamic law addresses directly. It mandates meticulous equality in material terms: time, provision, respect.
And the sources say he really strove for that.
He did. But the Quran itself, in chapter 4, verse 129, acknowledges the human difficulty here. It says men will never be able to maintain equality among their wives, however hard they try.
So the text itself admits it's basically impossible on an emotional level.
It does. And the Prophet himself is reported to have said that while he could control his actions, he couldn't control the emotional preference he felt in his heart for Aisha. It shows the human struggle, even for a prophet.
That discussion of legislative necessity leads us right into what is arguably the most scrutinized marriage of all.
Zainab.
His union with Zainab, the divorced wife of his adopted son, Zayd. The core critique is, was this a genuine legal necessity, or did the revelation just come conveniently to permit a marriage he already wanted?
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the key defense across both schools is that this marriage was a forced legal act, a necessary public demonstration.
Forced, okay, a demonstration to break what was a very, very deep taboo. What was the taboo?
The classical defense centers on the legal chaos of the time. Pre-Islamic custom treated an adopted son as a biological son, full stop.
And that created massive confusion.
Massive. In lineage or nasab. Who belongs to whom? It messed with inheritance and, critically, incest laws. If Zayd was legally his son, then Zainab, his ex-wife, would be forbidden to the Prophet forever.
So the Quran, in chapter 33, comes in and explicitly abolishes this idea that adopted sons are biological sons.
Exactly. And the marriage to Zainab was commanded to demonstrate this new law. It was a performative act of lawmaking, using his own life to shatter that custom.
By marrying Zayd's ex-wife, he proved that Zayd was legally not his son.
Irrevocably. But critics, of course, say this was just a convenient justification.
How did the scholars refute that?
Well, the classical reports stress that the Prophet actually resisted the marriage. He was afraid of the public criticism, the slander from hypocrites who would accuse him of immorality.
And the revelation itself addresses this.
It does. Verse 33.37 reportedly chastises him for fearing people more than God. It implies his reluctance was a fault, that he was dragging his feet on a difficult duty.
That is significant. Being chastised for worrying about public opinion suggests it was difficult, not desirable.
And beyond that, they point out Zainab was his cousin. He knew her his whole life. If he wanted to marry her, he could have done it before he arranged her marriage to Zayd. The timeline just doesn't support the convenience argument.
So if the Zainab case was this specific historical law reform, how do modern Muslim ethicists deal with adoption today?
They treat it exactly like that, a historical law reform. Modern scholars stress that Muslims today are encouraged to adopt, as in provide legal guardianship and care without importing that old pre-Islamic status.
So they separate the act of caring for a child from the legal fiction of biological lineage.
Precisely. They argue it's presentism to judge a 7th century legal act by 21st century family concepts. It solves a specific legal problem of that time.
This brings up a broader question about revelations concerning his personal life. Why would God reveal verses about his domestic disputes?
The scholarly view is that his household was essentially a public institution. These verses weren't just for him. They were providing eternal guidance for the whole community on fairness, privacy, how to treat one's family.
So his private life became public law.
His domestic events were transformed into teachable legal precedents. And it's important to note, not all those revelations benefited him personally.
Right.
Classical sources emphasize that some verses actually constrained him, like forbidding him from taking any new wives after a certain point. That directly undermines the idea that revelation was just a tool for self-interest.
Let's turn now to what is, for modern readers, the most ethically challenging area. Concubines and relations with slave women, what the text calls those your right hands possess.
We have to. And we have to start by grounding this in history. Slavery was a global institution, brutal and widespread. Islam didn't invent it. It encountered a pre-existing system and, the argument goes, began to regulate and reform it.
So how did the classical defense frame that regulation?
They note that the Quran permitted relations with lawfully held female captives under very strict conditions. This was framed as an alternative to the pre-Islamic chaos of, say, forced prostitution. It ensured the women, and any children, got legal recognition and support.
And this leads to the critical legal protection known as walad.
Yes, this was a huge step. A slave woman who bore her master a child, walad, automatically became free when he died.
And the child.
The child was born free, with equal status and inheritance rights. It integrated them fully into the family and created a clear path out of slavery.
What about Maria el-Qibtiyya? She bore the prophet a son.
She was diplomatic gifts from the ruler of Egypt. Sources portray her as being honored, treated with great respect. Her experience is often used to illustrate the prophet's personal kindness to the women under his care.
But the crucial issue for any modern reader is consent and human rights. How can any of this align with the claim that Islam elevated the status of women?
And here we see the sharpest divergence between the classical and modern arguments. The modern Muslim scholars argue that the Quran established a clear trajectory toward abolition.
A progressive social movement that started but wasn't completed in the 7th century.
That's the idea. The framework restricted how people could be enslaved, and it made freeing slaves' manumission a primary way to atone for sins.
They focus on the higher principles, the makut.
Exactly. The ultimate aims of the law: human dignity, justice, life. They argue that these principles supersede the historical application.
So in practical terms, what's the modern legal consensus?
The modern consensus is clear. With the international abolition of slavery, the permission for relations with those your right hands possess has zero legal application today. It's obsolete.
Because full human dignity and freedom are now the ethical baseline.
Yes, and therefore, sexual relations are only permissible within a fully consensual marriage. The historical context no longer applies in the 21st century.
So for them, the prophet's exemplary role is found in his mercy and his efforts to free people, not in replicating the institution he was working within.
Exactly. He's seen as a moral leader in dismantling systems of exploitation. His example is in the justice he showed to the vulnerable, which aligns with the highest ethics of the faith.
So what does this all mean for us today? We have these two powerful frameworks operating. You have the classical view of specific, mission-bound legal allowances, and the modern view emphasizing the ethical principles, justice, mercy over the historical forms, like polygamy or concubinage.
And when critics ask how he could be the final prophet if his practices seem so outdated, the scholarly response rests entirely on this distinction between fixed, eternal principles and flexible, transitional rules.
The principles are the constant. The social forms change.
That's the argument.
Let's quickly touch on the gender asymmetry. Why was polygyny allowed for men, but polyandry prohibited for women?
The classical justification was based on the social roles of the time, the man's duty to provide financially, and the need for paternity certainty for lineage and inheritance.
But modern Muslim thinkers, they acknowledge this is a point of critique today.
They absolutely do. And they're actively working to reform family laws to align more with today's understanding of equality, emphasizing the Quranic ideals of mutuality and mercy in marriage.
So finally, on this idea of judging the past by modern standards, modern scholars agree context matters, but do they essentially concede that some of these historical practices were, well, suboptimal by today's ethics?
In effect, yes. They affirm that today, full human dignity demands we move beyond that historical application. They see monogamy, full consent, and the abolition of slavery not as secular ideas, but as the logical, ethical endpoint of the reform process the prophet himself began.
Ultimately, then, the entire defense seems to rest on this idea that his marital life was defined by the burden of legislative duty and social welfare, not by personal desire.
Right. Especially when you consider that historical sources confirm he lived a very ascetic life and died without personal wealth.
It's a sophisticated response.
Yeah.
It requires understanding 7th century norms, his specific legal roles, and the overall direction of Islamic law toward reform.
It's not a static picture at all. It's a dynamic theological argument.
And this deep dive really shows that the goal isn't just to defend a historical figure, it's to try and extract the timeless ethical principles, justice, mercy, care for the vulnerable, from practices that were historically regulated but are now seen as incompatible with the ethical baseline that Islam itself produced.
Which raises an important question for you, the learner, to think about. If the modern scholarly response relies on interpreting the trajectory of reform, rather than just replicating the prophet's personal circumstances, how do we determine, in any tradition, which historical actions are eternally prescriptive and which were just transitional steps toward a higher moral goal?